The stars above Kepler 442b burned cold and white, nothing like the warm yellow sun that humanity had left behind centuries ago. And yet the colonists of New Valberg had learned to call this alien sky home. The colony sat on the edge of a vast green plain, where strange purple grasses swayed in winds that smelled faintly of copper and rain. And at the center of it all stood a biodome called the Ark, a massive glass and steel structure that held the last living pieces of Earth that these people would ever touch with their own hands. Inside the Ark, there were birds that sang songs no alien world had ever heard, and trees that had grown from seeds carried across the black ocean of space, and animals that padded and crawled and slithered through enclosures designed to remind them of a planet they had never seen, but somehow still remembered in their bones. And in one of those enclosures, in a rocky corner lined with dry brush and hard-packed dirt, there lived a honey badger named Rattel. He was not a large animal, maybe 12 kilograms of muscle wrapped in loose thick skin that hung on his body like armor 2 sizes too big. And his eyes were small and black, and full of a fury that never seemed to sleep. And every single handler who had ever worked with him carried scars to prove that Rattel did not like being told what to do. He had bitten Dr. Ferreira on the thumb so badly that the man needed bone reconstruction, and he had escaped his enclosure 11 times in a single year, using methods that the engineering team still could not fully explain. And once he had broken into the food storage building and eaten his way through 6 kilograms of honeycomb before anyone found him asleep in the wreckage, with sticky paws and absolutely no remorse. The maintenance crew hated him, the veterinary staff feared him, and Commander Liang once called him the most expensive 12 kilograms of pure stubbornness this colony has ever fed. Children loved him, and none more than Mila Okonkwo. Mila was 7 years old, with dark brown eyes that were always looking at something the adults had stopped noticing. And she had her mother's quiet courage and her father's laugh. And she was afraid of absolutely nothing except the dark and being alone, which on a colony world at the edge of known space were perfectly reasonable things to fear. Her mother was Dr. Adizi Okonkwo, the colony's chief xenobiologist, a woman who had left Earth to study alien life, and who spent her days cataloging creatures that had no names yet in any human language. And her father had died during the colony's 2nd year, when a transport shuttle failed on re-entry. And so Mila had learned early that the universe was not always kind, but that you kept going anyway. Mila had discovered Rattel by accident, one evening when she had wandered into the Ark after hours, because the sounds of the Earth animals made her feel less alone, and she had pressed her face against the glass of his enclosure, and watched him dig furiously at the ground for no apparent reason. And she had whispered to him that she liked digging too. Rattel had stopped and looked at her, and something passed between them that neither science nor language could properly hold. After that night, Mila came back every evening, sneaking past the security locks with a child's gift for finding gaps in adult systems, and she brought him things. Slices of mango from the greenhouse, and chunks of honeycomb that she traded her dessert rations to get. And she would sit on the ground outside his enclosure and talk to him about her day while he ate. At first, Rattel ignored her, the way he ignored everything that was not food or an enemy. But after a week he began eating closer to the glass, and after a month he began waiting at the glass before she arrived. And after 3 months, the veterinary staff noticed something that made them check their instruments. Twice, SP, Rattel had stopped biting. Not everyone. He still terrorized Dr. Ferreira, and he still hissed at the cleaning drones. But when Mila was near, he was calm in a way that honey badgers are simply not supposed to be calm. And he would press his broad, flat head against the glass, where her small hand rested on the other side. And he would make a sound low in his throat that was not quite a purr, because honey badgers do not purr, but was something close enough that Mila called it singing. Dr. Okonkwo discovered her daughter's secret visits on a Tuesday evening when she followed the sound of Mila's laughter through the empty biodome and found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, while Rattle rolled on his back on the other side of the glass, like a creature that had never known a violent day in his life. She should have been angry. She should have grounded Mila and reported the security gap. But instead, she knelt beside her daughter and watched, tighten in her chest that was both wonder and fear. "Mustelids do not bond like this," she wrote in her journal that night. "He is not tamed. That word means nothing with this species. He has chosen her, and I do not fully understand what that means, but I know it is something old and real, and not to be taken lightly." 6 months passed and Radel and Mila became a quiet legend in New Valberg, the little girl and the angriest animal on the planet, and people would smile when they told the story, and life on the frontier went on the way it always did, with small joys and hard work, and the slow building of something that might one day be called home. And then the long-range sensor screamed. Commander Liang was in his office when the alert came through, a cascade of red symbols across his display that meant something very large and very hostile had just entered the edge of the system, and within minutes the colony's small intelligence team had confirmed what the data was telling them. The Vreth Dominion had arrived. 43 ships hung in the black above Kepler 442b like a swarm of iron wasps, and every colonist who had ever read a frontier bulletin knew what the Vreth were and what they did, because the Vreth did not conquer, and they did not negotiate, and they did not take prisoners. They harvested. They stripped worlds of every biological resource worth taking, and they left behind nothing but dust and silence. Commander Liang sent a distress signal to the nearest Terran battle group, and the reply came back cold and mathematical. The fleet would come, but the fleet was 9 days away, and the Vreth would be landing in 3 days. That was all they had. The colony shifted overnight from a place of laughter and routine into something harder and older, and civilians who had never held a weapon were handed pulse rifles and shown where to point them, and engineers who built greenhouses began building barricades. The children were gathered up with gentle hands and trembling voices, and led down into the deep bunkers beneath the ark, where the rock was thick and the doors were steel. Mila walked with the other children through the cold corridor that led underground, clutching a stuffed animal in one hand and looking back over her shoulder at the biodome above, where the lights were flickering as power was pulled away to feed the defense grid. She could not see Radel from here, but she whispered to him anyway. "I will come back," she said. "I promise." Above her, inside the biodome that was growing dark and strange, Radel paced his enclosure in tight circles, his claws scraping the ground, his lips pulled back from his teeth, and he snarled at the ceiling, at the walls, at something he could not see but could feel in every cell of his ancient stubborn body. Something was coming. Something was wrong, and every instinct that a million years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming, that something was wrong, and every instinct that a million years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming, that something was wrong, and every instinct that a million years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming, that something was wrong, and every instinct that a million years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming, that something was wrong, and every instinct that a million years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming, that something was wrong, and every instinct that a million years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming, that something was wrong, and every instinct that a million years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming, that something was wrong, and every instinct that a million years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming, that something was wrong, and every instinct that 1,000,000 years of African sun and snake could not shake told him that something was coming. Venom and lion jaws had burned into his blood, was telling him one single thing: find her. The Vreth fleet filled the sky like a wound. 43 ships arranged in a formation that had no beauty and no wasted space. Each vessel a dark angular thing, built from chitin-laced alloys that looked more grown than manufactured. And from the ground, the colonists could see them hanging above the clouds, like the shadows of gods who had come not to judge, but to consume. The first transmission came at dawn, not a greeting and not a warning, but something far worse. A calm and clinical voice translated through algorithms that stripped it of all emotion and left only the cold bones of its meaning. Biological census requested, the voice said. Catalog all organisms. Submit genetic index. Compliance will reduce processing time. Non-compliance is irrelevant to outcome. They were not asking permission. They were not even threatening. They were simply informing the colony that it was already inventory, already product, already meat on a shelf, waiting to be weighed and packaged. Commander Liang stood in the command center with blood on his lip where he had bitten it, and fire in his eyes that had nothing to do with the tactical displays burning red around him. And he opened a channel on all frequencies so that every ship in orbit and every colonist in the bunkers could hear what he was about to say. This is Commander Deshi Liang of the human colony New Valberg, he said, and his voice did not shake. You are addressing a human settlement. We do not comply. We do not yield. Come down here and find out why. The channel closed, and for a long moment there was silence in the command center. And then Corporal Vasquez, at the sensor station, let out a breath that was half laugh and half prayer. And the defenders checked their weapons and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Aboard the Vreth flagship, the commander, a massive insectoid creature whose body was a cathedral of armored plates and twitching antennae, processed the human response through its tactical AI, and the AI returned a probability assessment that was almost insulting in its confidence. 97.6% chance of total colonial defeat within 48 hours. Resistance was not a strategic concern. It was a scheduling inconvenience. The Vreth commander gave the order, and the drop pods began to fall. They came down like burning seeds, hundreds of them, punching through the atmosphere and slamming into the earth around New Valberg with impacts that shook the ground all the way down to the bunkers. And from each pod poured the Vreth drones, 6-limbed soldiers bred in biological factories for one purpose only: to kill quickly and efficiently anything that stood between the Dominion and what it wanted. They were fast, faster than anything that size had a right to be, and their chitin armor could turn a glancing shot from a pulse rifle, and their forelimbs ended in serrated blades that could cut through colony-grade steel. The human defenders met them at the perimeter. The fighting was brutal and close and loud in ways that recordings would never capture. Pulse rifles cracking, and mining charges detonating, and people screaming not in fear, but in rage. Because these were frontier colonists, and they had built this place with their own bleeding hands, and they were not going to let it be taken by bugs from the dark between stars. They held the line, barely, with fire and fury, and the stubborn human refusal to accept mathematics as destiny. But while the main assault hammered the perimeter, a secondary Vreth strike team found a gap, a drainage channel on the colony's eastern edge that led beneath the outer wall and up into the biodome, and 12 Vreth drones poured into the ark like poison into a vein. Their mission was not combat, but collection. They carried biological sampling equipment and containment pods, and they moved through the biodome with mechanical efficiency, gassing enclosures, and extracting specimens, cataloging and harvesting while the battle raged outside. The gas and the explosions triggered a cascading containment failure. Enclosure doors that were designed to lock during emergencies instead sprang open as power surged and systems crashed. And suddenly the biodome was chaos. Animals running and screaming and crashing through vegetation as Vreth drones grabbed at them with clicking claws. And in the rocky enclosure on the north side of the dome, a steel door that had held a honey badger for 3 years groaned and popped open on broken hydraulics. Radel did not hesitate. He did not look around. He did not run for the exits where the night air and freedom waited. He turned away from the open sky and moved downward. He found the service corridors by instinct or by memory, the same corridors he had escaped into 11 times before. But this time he was not looking for food or freedom, with a purpose that burned in him like a hot wire, and his claws clicked on the metal floor as he descended level by level toward the deep places where the ground was cold and the air tasted of concrete and fear. A Vreth scout drone found him in a junction corridor 2 levels below the biodome, a small quadrupedal unit with sensory arrays and a capture net designed for biological specimens, and it scanned the creature moving toward it in the dim light and classified what it saw. Small terrestrial mammal, 12 kilograms, negligible threat index, capture priority low. The drone extended its net apparatus and moved to collect the specimen. Rattle hit it like a 12-kilogram missile of pure ancestral fury. He leaped onto the drone's sensory cluster, the cluster of delicate optical and chemical sensors that served as its eyes and nose, and he bit down with jaws that could crack a tortoise shell, and he twisted his entire body with the rotating flexibility that evolution had given his species specifically for moments when something larger and stupider thought it had the upper hand. The sensory cluster came apart in a spray of sparks and fluid, and the drone flailed and crashed into the corridor wall, and Radel dropped to the floor and kept moving without looking back, because he had somewhere to be, and nothing in this universe or any other was going to stop him from getting there. 3 more corridors, 2 more levels down, and then he could hear them. The muffled sound of children crying behind thick steel, the vibration of small voices pressed against the walls of the emergency bunker like birds trapped in a box. He found the bunker's sealed emergency hatch, and he began to scratch. Not the lazy exploratory scratching of a bored animal, but the focused, relentless digging of a creature that had evolved to tear into the hardened earth of the African savanna, to reach prey hiding in burrows, and his claws left bright silver marks on the steel as he worked at the edges and the seams. Inside the bunker, the adults heard the sound and raised their weapons, because nothing should be scratching at that door. And Dr. Okonkwo pushed Mila behind her and trained a pulse pistol at the hatch with hands that were steady, because she would not allow them to be otherwise. The scratching moved from the hatch to the ventilation grate beside it, and they could hear something forcing its way through the narrow duct with grunting, furious determination. And the grate cover popped off and hit the floor with a clang, and through the gap, covered in dust and drone fluid and sporting a new cut above his left eye, a honey badger squeezed his way into the bunker like the world's angriest and most unwelcome houseguest. He dropped to the floor, shook himself once, and then walked directly through the crowd of stunned, silent adults to where Mila stood with tears on her cheeks and her stuffed animal crushed against her chest. He sat at her feet and turned to face the room, and he bared his teeth at every shadow and every sound, and the growl that came from his throat was low and constant, and it did not stop. It was not a warning, it was a covenant. Mila sank to the floor and wrapped her arms around his neck, and buried her face in his coarse fur, and sobbed, and Ratal let her hold him, this animal who would never let anyone hold him, this creature of rage and teeth and unbroken will. He let a 7-year-old girl hold him in a bunker beneath an alien world, while bombs shook the ceiling above. Dr. Okonkwo lowered her weapon and stared at the animal she had studied, and the daughter she had raised, and the impossible thing happening between them. And the bunker shook again, and dust fell from the ceiling, like dirty snow. Ratal did not flinch. He pressed his body against Mila's small frame, and he growled at the war above them, at the aliens and the fire, and the entire merciless universe. He had found her. Nothing else mattered now. By the second day, the surface was gone. The colonists who had fought at the perimeter had been pushed back, corridor by corridor, and building by building, until the only human presence left above ground was fire and wreckage, and the survivors had retreated into the bunker network beneath the Ark, where the rock was old and the tunnels were narrow, and the Vreth could not bring their full numbers to bear. Commander Liang was alive, but barely. A piece of shrapnel had opened his left side from hip to rib, and the medical team had sealed it with biofoam and prayers. He sat propped against a wall in the secondary command post, with a tactical display balanced on his knee, and blood seeping through his bandages every time he moved. He had 47 fighters left, out of the original 112, and he had 231 civilians, including 86 children, in the deep bunkers. And he had enough food and water for maybe 5 more days if they rationed hard. And the nearest Terran battle group was still 7 days away. The math was not kind, but Commander Liang had stopped doing math 2 days ago and started doing something older and more human instead. He was refusing. The Vreth knew the humans were underground. They could detect the heat signatures and the electromagnetic noise of the bunker systems, and they had deployed their burrowing units, biomechanical tunneling machines that looked like enormous centipedes made of metal and hunger. The colonists could hear them grinding through the rock above and around them, getting closer hour by hour like the ticking of a clock that counted down to something terrible. In the children's section of the main bunker, the air was thick and warm, and smelled of too many bodies in too small a space, and the younger children cried in shifts as if they had worked out a schedule among themselves, and the older ones sat with blank faces and tried to be brave in the way that children try to be brave, which is to say by pretending very hard that they were not afraid. Mila sat in the corner, with Ratel pressed against her side, and she did not cry, because crying would mean admitting that the world had become something she could not fix. And instead she stroked Ratel's coarse fur, and whispered stories to him about the earth she had never seen, about African plains where animals like him ran free under a yellow sun, about honey and bees and a world where the worst thing that could happen was getting stung. Ratel listened, or did not listen. There was no way to know with honey badgers. But he leaned into her touch, and his one good eye watched the door, with a patience that was not calm, but coiled, like a spring made of muscle, and old violence, waiting for a reason to release. The reason came on the second night. A Vreth tunneler breached the wall of a side corridor, 40 meters from the children's section, and the rock split open like a wound. And 3 Vreth drones poured through the gap with their bladed forelimbs already extended, and their compound eyes scanning the dim corridor for targets. The 2 guards stationed at the junction opened fire immediately, their pulse rifles lighting up the corridor in strobing blue-white flashes, and the first drone took a bolt through its central thorax and collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs. And the second drone was hit in 2 of its legs, and stumbled and slowed, but did not stop. The third drone was untouched, and it was fast, impossibly fast, and it closed the distance to the first guard in 3 bounding strides, and its forelimb blade caught him across the chest, and he went down and did not get up. The second guard screamed and fired and hit the wounded drone twice more, and it finally fell. But the third drone was past her now, and moving down the corridor toward the children's section with a speed and focus that made it clear this was not random. The Vreth had found the heat signatures. They knew where the children were. The guard ran after it, but she was human and hurt and slow, and the drone was bred for this. It reached the door of the children's section. It began to tear at the barrier. Inside, the children screamed, and the 3 civilian adults in the room grabbed whatever they could find, a metal chair, a maintenance tool, a broken piece of pipe, and they stood between the door and the children, because that is what humans do. They stand between their young and the thing that wants to hurt them, even when they have nothing in their hands but despair and determination. The door buckled, and then something small and low and unbelievably fast shot across the room like a fur-covered bullet. Radel hit the Vreth drone as it pushed through the broken door, and he hit it with every gram of his 12 kilograms focused into his jaws and his claws, and the ancient boundless rage that was not emotion, but biology. The product of 1,000,000 years of evolution, on a planet that had never once rewarded giving up. He clamped onto the joint where the drone's forelimb met its thorax, the weakest point in the chitinous armor, and he bit down and twisted with that terrible rotating motion that his loose skin and flexible skeleton allowed, and the drone shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and it thrashed and slammed its body against the doorframe, trying to dislodge the creature that had attached itself to its body like a living wound. Rattle was thrown against the wall, and he hit the concrete with a sound that made Mila scream his name. And he lay still for 1 heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, and then he got up. He got up the way honey badgers always get up, which is to say, immediately and with interest in continuing the fight. The drone struck at him with its serrated forelimb, and the blade cut a line across his shoulder that opened his thick skin and drew blood that was dark and bright against his fur, and Ratel did not retreat. He lunged forward into the blow and clamped his jaws around the forelimb itself, and he bit through the chitin with a cracking sound that echoed off the bunker walls. The drone lost its primary weapon and staggered, and Ratel released the severed limb and went for the thorax again, climbing the drone's body with his claws digging into every gap in the armor. And he reached the nerve cluster at the base of the head, and he tore it out. The drone collapsed. Ratel stood on its body, swaying, bleeding from the shoulder, and from a gash on his head, and from somewhere under his belly that he could not reach, and he was breathing in sharp, ragged pulls that sounded like a small engine running too hot. But he turned and he walked back to Mila, and he sat at her feet, and he growled at the broken door, and the corridor beyond it, and the entire hostile universe that thought it could come through that door and touch his child. Armed colonists arrived 30 seconds later, and found the dead drone and the blood and the honey badger sitting in front of 16 unharmed children, like a gargoyle carved from scar tissue and defiance. The story spread through the comm channels within the hour. A honey badger, 12 kilograms, had killed a Vreth combat drone in single combat, and then walked back to the child he was guarding, as if it were simply what was expected of him. In the command post, Commander Liang heard the report, and something shifted in his chest, something that exhaustion and blood loss and the terrible mathematics of their situation had been slowly crushing. And it lifted, not because a small animal had killed an alien soldier, but because of what it meant. Because if a creature that small and that wounded could refuse to break, then what excuse did any of them have? He opened a channel to every surviving colonist in the bunker network, and his voice was rough and thin, but it carried. "This is Liang," he said. "I have just received a report that a 12-kilogram honey badger from our Ark biodome has killed a Vreth combat drone in defense of our children. He is wounded and bleeding and back on guard duty. Reinforcements are 4 days out. I am not going to be the one who quits before the honey badger does. Liang out." In the corridors and junctions and makeshift fighting positions of the bunker network, men and women who had been counting their ammunition and wondering if it was enough, heard those words, and something old and hot moved through them. Something that had nothing to do with tactics or probability, and everything to do with what it meant to be a creature of Earth. On the surface above them, the Vreth commander reviewed the engagement data and found an anomaly. A small terrestrial mammal had destroyed a combat drone, and the tactical AI flagged it as a statistical outlier and recommended no strategic adjustment. Dismissed it. It was one creature. It was irrelevant. That was the first mistake. On the third day, the Vreth sent the harvesters down. They were enormous things, bioorganic walkers that stood 4 stories tall on 6 jointed legs, and their underbellies were lined with extraction tubes and collection pods designed to scoop up organic matter by the ton. And they moved across the surface of New Valberg with the slow, patient confidence of predators who had never, in their entire evolutionary history, encountered anything that could make them afraid. They were built to crack open underground shelters the way a bird cracks a snail, and they began to drill. In the bunkers, the colonists felt the vibrations change from the grinding of the tunnelers to something deeper and more rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of stone and steel. And they knew that the Vreth had escalated, that the clock was ticking faster now, and that the 4 days they needed to survive had just become the longest 4 days in the history of the human species. Happening that the Vreth had not anticipated. The animals that had escaped the Ark during the biodome breach were still alive on the surface, and they were causing problems that the Vreth tactical AI had no framework to understand. A troop of baboons had discovered that Vreth's supply caches were made of biodegradable material that smelled faintly of protein, and they had raided 3 caches in a single night with the organized enthusiasm of creatures who had been stealing food from predators since before humanity existed, and they had scattered the contents across half a kilometer of wreckage. A pair of wild boars had charged through a Vreth sensor relay at full speed for no apparent reason other than that it was in their way, and the relay was now a pile of sparking debris, and the boars were somewhere in the eastern fields, rooting for tubers as if nothing had happened. A king cobra that had escaped its enclosure had found its way into a Vreth communications node, and had bitten 3 drones before disappearing into the colony's drainage system. And the venom had no effect on Vreth biology. But the drones had spent 40 minutes trying to classify and contain a threat that their programming simply could not categorize. The Vreth had evolved on a world of vast fungal plains, where the largest predator was a slow-moving filter feeder, and their entire model of biological threat assessment was built on the assumption that organisms behaved rationally, that they attacked to eat and fled to survive, and could be predicted by simple cost-benefit calculations. Earth animals did not follow these rules. Earth animals attacked things bigger than themselves for territorial pride, and they destroyed structures out of curiosity, and they bit threats they could not kill simply because the concept of not biting had never occurred to them. And the Vreth AI kept running its behavioral models, and the models kept returning errors. Below, the humans were writing their own chapter of the same lesson. A retired mining engineer named Pavel Orlov had spent the morning rigging a tunnel junction with shaped charges made from mining explosives and kitchen chemicals. And when a Vreth column of 8 drones marched through the junction, he had detonated the charges and brought 15 tons of rock down on them and on himself. And his last transmission was 2 words that his wife would later have carved into the memorial wall: "My turn." A teenager named Suki Park had found a plasma welding torch in a maintenance closet and had used it to hold a narrow choke point for 40 minutes against a steady stream of Vreth scouts, burning through them one by one in a corridor so tight that their numbers meant nothing. And when her fuel cell ran dry, she had picked up a dead drone's severed limb and used it as a club until reinforcements arrived. Commander Liang read each report as it came in, losses, and started counting something else, something that no tactical AI would ever know how to measure: the sheer relentless refusal of human beings to die according to someone else's schedule. And through it all, Radel patrolled, The colony's veterinary team had treated his wounds with surgical glue and stimulant patches that were designed for humans, but worked well enough on a metabolism as aggressive as his. And he moved through the corridors near the children's section with a limping, snarling determination that made even the armed guards step aside when he passed. Mila had torn a strip from her blanket and tied it around his neck, not as a collar, but as a bandage for a cut that kept reopening. And she had drawn a small star on the cloth with a marker she found in a supply crate. And Radel wore it without complaint. This animal, who had never tolerated anything from anyone, now wearing a child's drawing like a badge of rank. 5 breath drones punched through a weakened section of the bunker wall 30 meters from the children's section. And they came fast and coordinated in a way the first group had not, moving in a wedge formation designed to overwhelm defenders in enclosed spaces. And the 2 guards at the nearest junction were cut down in seconds. The drones moved toward the children's section, and there was no one between them and the door except a single bleeding animal who weighed less than a human child. Radel did not wait for them to arrive. He moved forward to the doorway of the children's section, the narrow frame where the corridor met the room, and he planted himself there, with his legs spread and his back low, and his one remaining good eye fixed on the advancing shapes in the dim corridor light. His left eye was gone, destroyed by a piece of shrapnel from the first breach that had finally worked its way through the swollen tissue, and the socket was sealed with biofoam and looked like a crater on the surface of a small angry moon. The first drone reached the doorway, and Radel launched himself at its legs, not its body, but its legs, because somewhere in the ancient calculations of his instinct, he understood that in this narrow space, if he could make them stumble, they could not swing their blades. And he bit through the joint of the lead drone's forward leg, and it buckled and partially blocked the corridor behind it. The second drone climbed over the first, and Radel met it with his claws in its face, raking across the compound eyes with a ferocity that sent fluid spraying across the walls, and the drone flailed blindly, and Radel used its confusion to sink his teeth into the nerve bundle at its throat. The third drone caught him. Its forelimb blade pierced his side, sliding between his ribs with a wet sound that Mila heard from inside the room. And Radel screamed, not a human scream, but a sound from deep in the evolutionary memory of a species that had been screaming at things trying to kill it since before the pyramids were sand. But he did not move from the doorway. He bit down on the blade inside him and twisted his body, and the blade snapped, and he fell to the ground with the broken metal still in his side, and he looked up at the drone above him, and he snarled with blood on his teeth, and absolute refusal in every fiber of his being. The drone raised its other forelimb for the killing blow. And then pulse fire erupted from behind the Vreth formation as 4 colonists arrived at a dead sprint and opened up with everything they had, and the corridor became a storm of light and noise and dying aliens. And when it was over, there were 5 dead drones and 4 exhausted humans, and 1 honey badger lying in the doorway of the children's section. He was still breathing, his small chest rising and falling in quick shallow pulls, and his one eye was still open and still facing outward, still watching, still guarding, and behind him in the room 16 children were unharmed, because nothing had gotten past him. Nothing had gotten past 12 kilograms of torn muscle and broken ribs and a devotion so deep and so pure that it made the humans who witnessed it feel something crack open inside their own chests. Mila pushed through the adults and dropped to the floor beside him and put her hands on his face and said his name over and over in a voice that was too small for the weight it was carrying. "You stay," she whispered. "You stay with me. You do not go." Radel's eye found hers, and his growl softened into something that was not a purr, but was close, so close. And his bloody paw reached out and rested on her knee. Across the bunker network, the story moved like electricity through water. The honey badger had held the door. The honey badger had fought 5 drones. and he was still alive, and he was still on guard, and exhausted, and running out of ammunition, heard it, and something inside them caught fire. In orbit, the Vreth commander reviewed the updated casualty reports and the timeline projections, and for the first time felt something that its species' emotional architecture could only describe as a deviation from optimal confidence. The tactical AI had been recalculating all day, and its projections kept moving in the wrong direction. Human resistance was not declining, it was intensifying, and the behavioral models that should have predicted collapse were instead returning a result that the AI could not process. These organisms do not optimize for survival, they optimize for something else. But the AI had no word for what that something was, and no model to predict its limits. The Vreth commander made a decision. Enough patience, enough strategy, enough trying to understand creatures that defied understanding. Orbital bombardment was authorized. Flatten the site. Harvest. From the ashes. Move to the next world. The weapons array began to charge. And then the sky above Kepler 442b split open with light. 16 Terran warships dropped out of slipspace in a staggered formation that lit up the Vreth sensor arrays like a sunrise. And they were early, 4 days early, because the fleet had received the distress call, and Admiral Kofi Asante had ordered his captains to burn their engines beyond every safety limit the manufacturer had ever set. The Admiral opened a channel on all frequencies, and his voice filled every speaker on every ship, and every bunker, and every Vreth command node in orbit. This is Admiral Kofi Asante of the Terran Navy. You are in orbit above our children. You have 60 seconds to begin your retreat. After that, we will teach you what Earth breeds. The 60 seconds passed. The Vreth did not retreat. The Admiral smiled, and the guns began to fire. The battle in orbit lasted 6 hours, and it was not a contest. The Vreth fleet had been designed to dominate undefended colonies, strip mine worlds that could not fight back, and their ships were built for efficiency and extraction, not for war against a species that had spent its entire history perfecting the art of killing things it disagreed with. Admiral Asante's battle group hit them with a precision and a fury that turned the orbital space above Kepler 442b into a graveyard of burning chitin and shattered alloy, and the Terran warships moved through the Vreth formation like wolves through a flock of something that had never seen wolves before. And one by one, the alien vessels broke and burned and fell. The Vreth flagship tried to run, its massive engines flaring as it turned away from the planet and aimed for the edge of the system. But the Terran destroyer Indomitable cut off its escape route and put 3 kinetic rounds through its engine block. Flagship went dark and drifted. And the last Vreth transmission from the bridge was a single word that their language had no proper equivalent for, but that the human translators would later render as impossible. While the fleet cleaned the sky, the drop pods fell again. But this time they carried Terran Marines in heavy assault armor, painted with unit insignia and combat honors, and the kind of controlled, professional violence that made the remaining Vreth ground forces realize very quickly that the situation had fundamentally changed. The Marines swept the surface in coordinated waves, clearing buildings and tunnels and wreckage with the methodical efficiency of people who were very good at their jobs and very angry about why they had been called to do them. And the Vreth drones that had terrorized the colony for 5 days found themselves facing opponents who were bigger and better armed and who fought with a cold, focused intensity that was somehow more frightening than the desperate fury of the colonists had been. In the command post, Commander Liang heard the sonic booms of the Marine drop pods, and the sound hit him like a physical force, like a hand on his chest, pushing the weight off. And he closed his eyes, and his lips moved, but no sound came out. And the medic beside him thought he might be praying, but he was actually counting. Counting the days they had held, counting the people they had lost, counting the impossible distance between what should have happened and what did. 5 days, he whispered, and the medic leaned closer and said, "Sir, the fleet was supposed to be 9 days out." And Liang opened his eyes, and they were wet and bright, and he said, "I know. They burned their engines for us. They burned their engines and came early." The Marines reached the bunker network within hours, breaching doors and clearing corridors, and calling out in loud, steady voices that help had arrived, that the colony was being secured. Over. And the colonists stumbled out of their shelters, blinking in the harsh tactical lights, with faces that had aged years in days. A Marine squad designated Fireteam Kappa reached the children's section of the main bunker, and the sergeant, a woman named Torres, who had served 3 combat deployments and had seen things that would have broken someone who was not made of whatever Torres was made of, keyed open the reinforced door and stepped inside with her weapon up and her voice calm. "Terran Marines," she announced, "you are safe now." She swept the room with practiced eyes and took in the scene. 16 children huddled in groups with their arms around each other. 3 civilian adults, standing with improvised weapons still raised, because they had not yet learned to stop being afraid. Medical supplies scattered on the floor, blood on the walls near the door, and at the center of it all, standing on the body of a dead Vreth drone that someone had dragged inside. To use as a barricade, a one-eyed honey badger covered in dried blood and surgical glue and a strip of blanket with a hand-drawn star on it, hissing at Sergeant Torres's boots with a fury that seemed deeply personally offended by the existence of footwear. Torres stopped, and she looked at the animal, and she looked at the carnage around the doorway, the gouges in the walls, and the alien blood, and the score marks from claws that were far too small to have done what they had clearly done. Mila stepped forward from the group of children, and she was thin and dirty, and her eyes were enormous in her small face. And she put her hand on Ratel's scarred back, and she looked up at the armored Marine with a steadiness that had no business being in the eyes of a 7-year-old. "He is with me," Mila said. "He kept us safe." Sergeant Torres looked at the child and the animal and the impossible evidence of what had happened in this room. And she was a Marine, and Marines do not cry on duty, but her jaw tightened in a way that her squad knew meant she was fighting something harder than any enemy she had ever faced. She straightened, brought her boots together, and rendered a full salute to a 7-year-old girl and a 12-kilogram honey badger. "Yes, ma'am," Torres said. "I can see that he did." The liberation of New Valberg took 2 more days of clearing and securing and counting the living and the dead. And when it was done, the numbers told a story that would be studied in military academies for generations. 47 defenders had held against a full Vreth invasion force for 5 days, with civilian weapons and mining equipment, and a refusal to die that the Vreth tactical AI had never been able to model. And they had lost 65 people, good people, brave people, whose names would be carved into a wall of black stone in the center of the rebuilt colony. But they had saved 231 civilians, including 86 children. Every single child in the bunkers had survived, and the reason for that survival was a mystery to the Vreth, and a miracle to the humans, and a very simple thing to a honey badger who had never in his life needed a reason more complicated than mine. Ratel survived his wounds, though it was a closer thing than anyone wanted to admit. The colony's veterinary team worked on him for 4 hours, with assistance from the fleet's medical specialists, and they removed the broken blade fragment from between his ribs, and they repaired the internal bleeding, and they cleaned and sealed the empty socket where his left eye had been. He would never see from that side again, and his left forelimb had sustained nerve damage that would make it difficult for him to dig, so the medical team fitted him with a small prosthetic claw, not a weapon, but a tool, a simple articulated piece that would let him scratch and burrow the way he always had. The recovery and the indignity of the medical cone they put around his neck for exactly 11 minutes before he destroyed it. And he tolerated all of this because Mila sat beside him through every hour of it, and held his paw and told him he was brave, and that she loved him, and that they were going home. The story of the honey badger's stand spread across human space like a signal fire. Within weeks, every colony and station and ship in the Terran fleet had heard about the animal that had killed Vreth drones and held a doorway and refused to abandon a human child, even when it cost him an eye and nearly cost him his life. And the story became something more than a story. It became a symbol. Soldiers began painting a honey badger silhouette on their armor in black and white, a small fierce shape above the heart, where it would be the last thing an enemy saw. And 3 warships were renamed: the TFS Radel, the TFS Honey Badger, and the TFS Don't Care. Operations Unit officially adopted the call sign Radel, with a unit patch that showed a one-eyed honey badger standing in a doorway. The Vreth Dominion received the full after-action report from Kepler 442b, and their intelligence division spent months analyzing the data, trying to understand how a frontier colony with minimal defenses had held for 5 days against a force that should have overwhelmed it in 48 hours. Their final report added a new classification to the Dominion's threat database for Earth origin fauna, and the classification read, "Do not engage. Organisms display illogical persistence aggression. Pain does not function as behavioral deterrent. Threat of death does not trigger retreat response. No known method of behavioral suppression. Extreme threat, regardless of physical size." For humans specifically, the Vreth appended a single note that their analysts had debated for weeks before agreeing on its accuracy, and translated into the nearest. They are all honey badgers. 6 months after the battle, New Valberg was rebuilding. The scars on the land were healing under alien sunlight and human hands. And the Ark Biodome had been restored with new glass and new systems and new animals brought from Earth on the same ships that carried building materials and medical supplies and letters from people on a dozen worlds who had heard the story and wanted the colony to know they were not alone. Raytel had a new enclosure in the Ark, a beautiful space with real rocks and native soil, and a climate system that replicated the heat of the African savanna, and it was the finest habitat any honey badger had ever been given. He had never once slept in it. Every evening as the alien sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned colors that Earth had never known, Raytel squeezed through the gap in the biodome maintenance hatch that the engineering team had quietly stopped repairing, and he waddled across the colony yard with his prosthetic claw clicking on the path and his one eye scanning for threats that were no longer there, but that he would never stop looking for. He scratched at the door of the Okonkwo family habitat, and Mila opened it, and he walked inside and curled up at the foot of her bed on a blanket that she had put there for him, and no one in the colony tried to stop him anymore, because some things were beyond rules and regulations and species classifications. On a quiet evening in the 7th month, Mila sat in her mother's lap in the living room, while Rattle dozed on the floor with his scarred body rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep sleep. And Mila looked at him for a long time, with the serious, thoughtful expression that children wear when they are working on a question too big for their vocabulary. "Mama," she said, "why did he come to me in the bunker when everything was scary and the bad things were coming? Why did he come?" Down instead of running away. Dr. Okonkwo stroked her daughter's hair and looked at the animal on the floor. This small, impossible, unbreakable thing that the African savanna had spent 1,000,000 years forging in venom and heat and the jaws of lions. This creature that had crossed a burning colony and fought through alien soldiers and torn his way through steel and stone to reach a child who was not his species and not his kin and not anything that biology could explain. She thought about Earth, about the planet she had left behind, about the world that had made honey badgers and humans, and all the other stubborn, furious, beautiful things that refused to stay down when the universe knocked them over. "Because, my love," she said softly, "that is what Earth teaches all its children. You protect what you love, no matter what, no matter the cost, no matter if the whole sky falls down on top of you. You protect what you love, and you do not stop." The gravity of a 7-year-old philosopher. And then she nodded, as if this was the answer she had been expecting. And she slid off her mother's lap, and went to Rattel, and lay down beside him on the blanket, and put her arm over his scarred back. Rattel's one good eye opened, golden and ancient, and full of something that science could not name, and did not need to. And he looked at Mila, and he pressed his broad, flat head against her chest, where her heart was beating. And he closed his eye again. Outside, the alien stars burned in patterns that no human constellation map had ever charted. And the colony lights glowed warm against the dark, and somewhere in the vast indifferent universe, the Vreth were updating their threat databases, and the Terran Navy was painting honey badgers on its warships. And the story was being told and retold on 100 worlds, by people who needed to believe that something small and fierce and full of love could stand against the darkness and win. On the floor of a small house on the edge of known space, a girl and a honey badger slept side by side, breathing together, safe together, home together. And nothing in the universe, not armies, not aliens, not the cold math of probability, or the vast empty distance between the stars. Nothing had been able to break what was between them. Because Honey Badger does not care what the odds are. Honey Badger does not care what the enemy is. Honey Badger only cares about one thing. And she was sleeping safely beside him, as she always would be, for as long as his scarred and stubborn and unbreakable heart continued to beat.